Hey guys, today we are starting our next unit, our next time period. It is time period 6 and it is from 1865 to 1898. And so that spreads from the end of the Civil War all the way up to the dawning of what some people see as the modern era around the turn of the century. And the first topic we're going to talk about and focus on all week is settling the West and the Great American West and more ideas about westward expansion and manifest destiny. We're going to try and make this one pretty quick, okay? So, the from the Great Plains in the east to like the California in the west, there was this idea that the West was a desert. The West has very coarse grasses that are meant to survive little rain, little water, until the winter when there's very, very harsh winters, the sun beating down on it all day, no tree cover. And so those very coarse grasses have very thick, knotted, and matted roots, which were difficult to break through with wooden plows that would often break. But when the invention of the steel plow comes around, those very knotted roots of those coarse grasses and bushes were able to be broken through, and underneath there is very fertile soil. So in the beginning, people thought that it was just this huge desert out there because nothing could grow except for those coarse grasses, but they were actually quite wrong. And that turning point, when those new inventions are made to help with commercial farming, like the steel plow and the mechanical reaper, will turn this idea of the desert into the Great West. So the people that live there originally are called the Plains Indians, including the Sioux and the Comanche are kind of like the biggest Native American tribes. And you've also got some Southwestern Indians like the Apache and the Navajo, and the Nez Perce and the Shoshone, which are more in the Oregon, Washington area. So those are kind of like our big Native American tribes. We're going to talk a lot about the Sioux today, and Sioux is spelled Sioux, the Sioux Indians. So in this time period, the entire area, in a very short amount of time, less than 50 years, is completely taken by white settlers, and Native Americans are forced onto reservations. And the thing is, we've already got this gold rush that happened in the 1840s, 1848, 1849, 1850 to California. And California is so heavily populated, it becomes a state in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850. And people realize there's not much gold left in California, so they start trickling into the West from California. And people from the East are tired of the cities, so they trickle into the West from the eastern coast. So they have, these Plains Indians have white settlers trickling in from both sides, wanting their land. So we're looking at a time period at the end of the Civil War Reconstruction period, the election of 1876 that leads to the Compromise of 1877, the Dirty Deal that ended Reconstruction but gave the electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate. And this is how many states we have. Kansas and Nebraska were established during the Civil War, California, or before the Civil War, California. And we've got this mass amount of territory here with a lot of Native Americans concentrated in Oklahoma, which was deemed Indian territory at the time, and up here in the Dakotas, which was also deemed an Indian territory. But they're everywhere, and they have rights to those lands, and you have settlers trickling in from both sides. You also see not just white settlers, but African-American settlers going out west. So a lot of California will be African-Americans who wanted to hit it big with the gold or the agriculture after gaining their freedom in the Civil War. As many as 1 in 4 cowboys were actually African Americans who were escaping the discrimination of the South and wanting to live this lifestyle where they're their own boss and no one is in charge of them. And it could be days before they see anyone else. They are working for themselves. We'll get to what cowboys do in a minute. So in order to get these large swaths of land that are unclaimed, like what you see here, the white settlers had to subdue Native Americans and put them into reservations or territories just for them. The Plains Indians, they had horses due to the Spanish introduction of horses in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. It made them more nomadic. It made them more violent in the way that they wage war, but it also changed their culture to, by the time that we have this westward expansion in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, to really revolve around buffalo hunting and following herds of buffalo. And as such, tribes were smaller and more nomadic and less unified, except for some large ones like the Sioux Nation. So the government policy towards Native Americans in the beginning kind of regarded Indian tribes as independent, but also we're in charge of them, wards of the state. And you see how that's an oxymoron. Like there's a discrepancy there where you can't treat them as independent and then say we're in charge. They made many treaties with them that required ratification by the Senate. Okay, we get this if you get this. We'll leave you alone if you do this. But most white settlers just ignore those treaties and go take that land anyway and settle those places and hunt those animals that the government had made treaties outlawing white settlers from doing so in order to help the Native Americans. And then the government just doesn't enforce it. So both are at fault there. So we're going to see a change. This is like a change in continuity thing of how the government deals with Native Americans. In the beginning, which we've already talked about, a lot of it was just push them out of the way. Okay, so think Indian removal in the 1830s, taking them from that south area in the Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama area, moving them across the Mississippi River to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, and that was a lot of Cherokee. Then we get into this period of concentration, and this is before and during the Civil War, moving Native Americans to smaller areas, not quite tiny areas, but like whole territories called Indian Territory. And they specifically exerted this pressure on natives to move to deserts because white settlers didn't want those areas. Then it goes even further, and they start taking pieces of that land and shrinking it and saying, this is your reservation. We are reserving this land just for this tribe. And finally, there's a period of assimilation. And this is even if you live on a reservation, you should still have white culture. Assimilation or Americanization is the idea that if you live in America, you should speak English, you should dress like white culture says you should dress, you should have a job like white culture says you should have a job, you should have a family, a wife, a few kids, like you should be like a white American. And that's the idea of assimilating them into white American culture. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which had been established in order to deal with Native Americans and actually were the ones that enacted Native American removal in the 1830s, were in charge of the reservations. And the Native Americans surrendered their ancestral lands, the land that they owned, in exchange for the idea that they will be left alone if they live on this reservation. No one's going to bother them except the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to bring them farming supplies and food and clothing and just take care of them. But the Bureau was already corrupt. Federal Indian agents, which was their job, were often corrupt. They gave poor or damaged provisions. They withheld things. They punished Native Americans. They ignored treaties and let white settlers seize their land and kill their game. And the conflicts, the poor administration by the Bureau of Indian Affairs resulted in conflicts between tribes and nearby white settlers, whereas the white settlers would just always win. And we have a series of Indian wars that we're not going to get into a lot. You're going to have to read it more in your Henrietta, okay? And these Indian wars are where troops are sent to clear out Native Americans. Oftentimes they are Civil War veterans. Sometimes they are Black freedmen looking for a job. And we have kind of these big names that you've probably heard of before: General Sherman, General Sheridan, and General Custer, who you see right there. So let's get into kind of what these wars are. But first, let me one of General Sheridan's most famous statements is the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And he is one of the men that is sent to mediate conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans. Well, you can guess who he's going to err on the side of. He's going to favor the white settlers. So the first of these wars is the Sand Creek Massacre. So this is in Colorado in 1864 on the Sand Creek Reservation, which is just this desolate desert. Nothing grows there. Native Americans had been taken from their land because there was gold found on their land and shoved onto this horrible reservation. There were supposed to be treaty negotiations going on, and an army, a volunteer, but under the umbrella of the government army, was sent to keep peace between white settlers and Native Americans until the treaty was negotiated for the land that had gold on it. And the volunteer army got mad at the Native Americans that they were supposed to be protecting and entered a camp full of women and children, and massacred tons of them and wounded tons of them, just to send a message. So the Native Americans had been blindsided because they had been promised immunity and they had been put under the protective custody of the government, but that turned out to not be the case. Then we have the Battle of Little Bighorn, sometimes called Custer's Last Stand, led by George Custer. The Native American warriors were led by Sitting Bull, and this is all part of a larger called the Sioux War of 1876. Gold miners are rushing to South Dakota. They want gold that's on Indian land. There's all these skirmishes. The army is sent to try and keep the peace. The same thing happens. So Custer's forces clash with 2,500 Native American warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and Custer and his 264 men, are completely wiped out. And it is their last stand. And the Native Americans win this battle of the larger Sioux War. Right, the final little battle of the Indian Wars we're going to go over here in this lecture, and you're going to read a lot more in your textbook, is the Battle of Wounded Knee. This is in 1890, and it's the last major clash, the last major battle of this series of Indian Wars between U.S. troops and Native Americans. So the issue here is the army is sent to put an end to what is called the Sacred Ghost Dance that had spread throughout the Dakota Sioux. And the ghost dance was, believers of this ghost dance cult believe that if they danced the ghost dance, then the buffalo that Native Americans depended on and white settlers had killed would return, and the spirit's wrath would wipe out the white man, and the buffalo would return, and Native Americans would rule the land again. And this made white settlers who lived near the Native Americans very fearful. They thought it was like a war dance, and that the Native Americans were going to come kill them. So fearful whites successfully urged the U.S. government to make the ghost dance illegal. And this Sioux ghost dance continued to go throughout the Dakotas. And at the Battle of Wounded Knee, a smaller tribe of Sioux, 300, were surrounded by soldiers and killed, men, women, and children, and 300 of them were killed. And we will talk more about the ghost dance when we come back in person. So when we're looking at all of the Native American wars that stretched from the 1860s to the 1890s, by the 1890s, the whites had won. And all tribes were in reservations and struggling. They did not have any more of their ancestral land. The buffalo had been completely exterminated. The federal government was supposed to feed them, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs was very corrupt. And this was because there was more railroad expansion and gold and silver found on Native American reservations. And part of it also is the spread of white diseases and alcoholism to natives as well, just in a lesser extent than when whites and natives first had contact at the very beginning of our class. But let's talk buffalo for a second. The thing that was so horrendous to Native Americans was they depended on the buffalo, and they used all parts of the buffalo. So they used the hide for clothing and tents. They used the bones for tools. They ate the meat. They used the fat for burning and preserving food and things like that. They used buffalo chips to start fire. That's buffalo poop. And so they wouldn't over hunt the buffalo. They would just follow the herd and hunt as they needed, whereas whites would just kill for sport or kill for the meat and leave the bones and the fat and all the intestines and stuff just lying out there to decay in the sun. And that extermination of the buffalo also led to the degradation of Native American tribes, and the Plains Indians really depended on buffalo. All right, so in 1887 is like the nail in the coffin of Native American ownership of land, and this is called the Dawes Severalty Act. Okay. So the Dawes Severalty Act is sometimes called the Allotment Act because it allots land. It kind of forces American assimilation onto Native Americans in a sneaky way. So the idea was that tribes are no longer legal entities, and Native Americans are still seen as Native Americans, but they're supposed to be individual families, not tribes, and that thus tribes cannot own land. So there goes the idea of some of the reservations. There goes the idea of tribal ownership of land, which was part of Native American culture. And instead, the point is to set up individual Native American family heads, and each of those heads of family would get an allotment of 160 free acres of land. So it has it looks good on paper, right? Oh, you get free land and we're not going to come and take it ever again. But the intent was very sneaky. The intent was to eradicate Native American culture. And make Native Americans behave like white settlers. And if they do behave, once they assimilate, which was a 25-year, you had to own the land and farm it kind of situation, then you got to own it forever. It belonged to you and your family, and you could pass it down to your children. But the purpose is to get rid of their culture. No longer in tribes, no longer tribe ownership and tribe community. No longer tribe survival or hunting or nomadic lifestyle. You will stay here. You will live as a family. You will farm, just like white people. That was the intent. Okay. So the results were it accelerated an already advanced decay of Native American culture. A bunch of Native American land was lost. So you'll see in this ad, the Native American land that wasn't allotted in the Allotment Dawes Severalty Act was sold to white settlers. The land rushes are like white settlers are rushing to what was once Cherokee Creek and other lands, and essentially a lot of Native American land is lost. Native American children are encouraged and sometimes forced to go to white schools, which is what you see up here. You see Lakota boys as they came into the school, and as they left, their hair is cut. They're in white clothes. They probably have names like John and William and Peter now, and they're taught English. And so it is trying to stop the passing on of Native American culture to the next generation purposefully. A side effect of this, though, is that Native American population grows because they are going to be a little bit more sufficient, even though at first they're not good at farming because they had a different culture of communal farming. And actually, you have already watched a mini series called Into the West about the Carlisle Indian School and the tactics that they would use to try and assimilate Native American children. And sometimes Native American families, the children would be taken, but more often than not, they'd be willingly given up. The families were just suffering so much they didn't have food to feed their children. And so when a white headmaster says, we'll feed your child, just send them to this school, they did it because it was an opportunity to not starve. All right, moving away from Native Americans and looking at the reasons that white settlers would settle in the West, we've got mining, cattle, and farming. So mining in this time period is in those mineral-rich areas were the first ones to be extensively settled, look like the 48ers and the 49ers in California. Copper lead 10 quartz zinc is more profitable than gold or silver because there's a lot less gold and silver and it's harder to get to, whereas the copper, tin, and lead are more close to the surface. So it starts out with these prospectors that head out west and they're like, I'm going to hit it big, but they don't have the materials, they don't have the capital, they don't have the money to set up these large scale mines that can dig deep, deep into the ground. So when those big companies come out and they set up big commercial mines like this, those prospectors who thought they were going to hit it big and be rich end up working for these guys. We get some pretty famous towns because of mining. Pikes Peak, Colorado. Gold was discovered there in 1858, and thousands of peakers rushed to the west. Not many profited, but lots of people stayed. And Pikes Peak is pretty popular to this day. Comstock Lode was discovered in Nevada. It had gold and silver in 1859. And a huge amount of people headed to Nevada very quickly, so much so that it became a state. Okay. So, copper is found in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Copper is probably one of the most profitable because it's needed for all the new technology like telegraph and electric and telephone wires. And when a town found gold, or when someone found gold or silver or copper or zinc or whatever, zinc, not link, lead and zinc, the town would just boom. Saloons, stores, hotels, schools, houses, farms. And then when the mine ran out and people started losing their jobs and they weren't mining anymore, it goes from these boom towns to ghost towns. And some of them are historically preserved, and you can go see Wild West ghost towns. Okay, so the overall significance of mining is it attracted a huge population and wealth in the Wild West. It helped finance the Civil War because this was happening during the Civil War. It facilitated the building of railroads. We got to have railroads out there so we can get those precious metals back to the East. It intensified conflict between whites and Native Americans. It enabled the government to resume collecting gold and silver as specie. So it starts this issue of should debtors have to pay in soft money, which is inflated sometimes, or hard money, which like always has its value. And then we kind of add to the American folklore and literature like Mark Twain and Paul Bunyan and those kind of like cowboys versus Indians kind of American tall tales that are still popular. Okay, let's talk about cattle ranching or raising. This is another reason many white settlers came to the West. The Transcontinental Railroad meant that there was a railroad that stretched from the east all the way to the west, and it continued, and there were a lot more railroads. And the idea was people would drive their cattle. They would breed Texas Longhorn cattle down here, cowboys would, and they would drive their cattle up to the railroads and sell them at the stockyards. And they could be sold as live cattle, or because the refrigerated rail car is invented during this time period, they could be slaughtered at a stockyard or at a butcher and sent to the east. Oftentimes, Chicago was a giant meat packing. They received tons of refrigerated meat from the west. And then the cowboys would go back down to the south, breed more cattle, and the next year drive them all the way up. And some of these big ports were Dodge City and Abilene, Kansas. And Denver, Colorado, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, where cattle were sold. So that's everything I just told you. Texas cowboys would breed and herd cattle up to the railroads, have them shipped east, but there are some challenges here. Eventually, there's so many cattle out there. There's overgrazing. The grass is not able to regrow between the years. And then once farmers go out there, they resent cows tramping through their fields. So they start fencing their fields. Well, wood is expensive and trees are hard to come by sometimes in the Great Plains. So what do? Barbed wire is invented. Joseph Glidden invents barbed wire. So these homesteaders brought out by the Transcontinental Railroad wanting to start their own farms, set up fences with wooden posts and a string or multiple strings of barbed wire. And they're big areas that are barbed wired in that are now for farmers and their cattle, their domesticated cattle. And they were just too numerous to be cut down by the cowboys. And the whole idea of the cowboys was challenged by scorching summers and long winters, overexpansion, overgrazing. And people just started doing more domesticated cattle after this. So the years of the cowboy were very short. All right, let's talk farming. The Homestead Act of 1862 really encouraged people to move out west. Settlers could acquire as much as 160 acres of land for kind of free if they got the homestead papers and they lived on it and farmed on it for 5 years, improving it and paying like a nominal tax on it, like a small tax. So the idea is it encouraged westward settlement. Even if the government didn't really make money, they knew that it would bolster the economy because people would be farming and moving and getting on the railroads and selling things and shipping things. So about 15,000 families make it there. Many are forced to give up, and some just go back to the cities. The West is hard. There's drought, there's hail, there's sometimes it doesn't rain forever. Sometimes there's a snowstorm that lasts for all of winter, and you have to survive out there. And sometimes, this is really gross, there would be these giant like swarms of crickets that would zoom through and eat up all your crops, and then you're just out of luck. And there was a quick cricket swarm the size of Rhode Island that just swept through the West one year. You also have, during this time period, people take advantage of the homesteaders, the free land. Corporations will pay people to act like they're a homesteader, buy the land, and then give it to the corporation so corporations could buy up giant swaths of land for commercial farming. So that myth about the Great American Desert broken up by the steel plow, barbed wire around, no wild cattle, we're going to get new water techniques, the railroad can transport your crops. It's a good idea to move out west if you're hardy enough to do it. But this whole idea of the out west and the frontier, it ends. Because by 1890, all of this is no longer a territory, is states, okay? So all of these states are added within a 20-year period. Less than a 20 or 15-year period, and the United States is kind of what we see it is today, except for a few territories here and there, and Alaska and Hawaii. In 1889, that is exacerbated by the Oklahoma Land Rush. Okay, so the Oklahoma Land Rush is fantastic. It's horrible, but the idea of it was something. So Native Americans, even though it's called Indian territory, are kicked out of a large swath of Oklahoma and put onto smaller reservations. And the government decides to give out that land in order to encourage westward movement. And there's a date, April 22nd, 1889. And the U.S. is going to make available to settlers those vast stretches of land that were formerly occupied by Native Americans like Creeks and Seminoles in Oklahoma. So we have 100,000 people at that border, ready to go at the time that they say, and they literally like shoot a gun in the air and a cannon and say, go, and you run and grab a piece of land with a big old flag. So you went to an office before and you said, I want this plot of land or that plot of land, or I want this many acres. You literally had to run and grab it, and you'd plant your flag and pick up the flag that was there and take that to the office and register that is your land and it was free. Some people were called Sooners, which is why you get the Oklahoma Sooners, that went to Oklahoma and pretended that they were part of the land rush, but actually they grabbed land before it was too soon. And by the end of the day, 2 million acres had been claimed, settled, and filed with the land office. And so now, very, very soon, Oklahoma was Indian territory. Boom, overnight, they have enough population to make it a state. All right, so cash crops here. When we're looking at small farms out west, the picture in your head is correct, but many corporations start turning the farm into more like a factory commercial sort of thing. So we've got, not only in the West, but also in the South, large farms operate under corporate structures where they hire farmhands and they have managers. And they will subsidize railroads to be built out to their farms so that they can ship goods back east. And in the South, tenant farming and the crop lien system really encouraged that, where poor whites and freed African Americans would rent land. But most of the profits would end up going to the landowner. However, when we look at farmers out west, they have some issues here. Deflated currency means that food prices are going to be lower, especially because there's going to be a surplus of food because of all these small farmers and commercial farmers. There's going to be natural disasters, freezing temperatures, cricket swarms, insects, locusts, diseases, horrible, horrible scorching summers, and awful, awful snowstorm winters. No water, no rain, tornadoes. That west area is Tornado Alley. Sometimes there were high property taxes or protective tariffs put up by the government, hurt the South cotton manufacturing. Sparse population, so not many people live out there. Big commercial farms bought up a lot of land, but then those small farmers, they don't have many towns, so they're not meeting, they're not talking government, so they're not really represented. They don't have a lot of population in their states. And then we're going to talk about trusts, and trusts are like when companies start monopolizing, consolidating and monopolizing a market. So barbed wire starts to become expensive because companies monopolize it. Fertilizer starts to become expensive. Harvesting equipment becomes expensive. Railroad and freight and shipping rates become expensive because railroads monopolize and say, hey, if we all charge a lot of money, then they have to pay it. So trust setting high prices hurts the small farmer as well. All right. That is it for today. Thank you guys very much. And we'll talk more when we come back.